Hello and welcome to Community Topics number 36 of Dualistic Unity. I am becoming more and more aware of my excuses and how many different roles they play or different costumes they put on as a way of avoiding the recognition that's usually right in front of me when I let go of the story and the excuse that story oftentimes becomes.
And I love the fact that you are no longer pulling your punches when it comes to dealing with your own triggers, when it comes to dealing with your own excuses or dealing with your own narrative. You walk right up to whatever it is you're holding on to and go, nah, I'm going to let that go and I'm going to deal with it head on. And I have really enjoyed the process of watching you take that stance more and more throughout the last 4 seasons. And I know a great many of the people in our community have been doing the exact same thing. And I think it's really appropriate to today's community topic, which is conditioned passivity. Because what we're talking about is the experience of freedom, which is not passive. It very much requires your participation. But there is this mechanism that happens when we get caught up in our narrative that almost requires us to act differently in order to get what we think we want or get what we think we need. And so this is going to be a fun community topic. Specifically, I wanted to mention the fact that when we're talking about conditioned passivity, we're really also talking about passive avoidance. So in psychology with rats, for example, a rat likes to hide in a dark hole and stay safe. And so if a rat, every time it goes to that dark place, receives an electrical shock, it will eventually just avoid going towards that dark space. It won't even make the effort anymore. It will just know that there is a consequence to doing so, and it will no longer stand up and try to experiment with that, even if there is no more electrical shock. And so, on the one hand, we have the conditioning aspect of this. And on the other hand, we have the false certainty that we know it's going to happen. So it really is an interesting balance and an interesting question. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes. But I think what excites me the most about this is that you started this episode talking about making excuses. And I think that is even more of a consideration than conditioned passivity, because while that is true, while there are plenty of consequences in our society and in our life that kind of indicate maybe we shouldn't do certain things, maybe we shouldn't stand up for ourselves, maybe we shouldn't question certain things, all of that, a lot of it is us looking for a scapegoat too, so that way we don't have to change.
Yeah, you can come up with hundreds, if not thousands, of reasons to continue to be passive. And as you take those to be the truth, and as you're like, yeah, you know what? That has some validity. That's the conditioning that's allowed to continue happening. Because what we're not saying is that there isn't some good reason that you can convince yourself for being conditioned in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot of things out of our control growing up, as children, especially where a lot of the conditioning happens. But there comes a point where, yes, that's the case. Yes, you can come up with an excuse. Yes, there is no one who's going to say that isn't valid. But what is it doing? What are you holding yourself back from? Because as long as you continue to buy into the excuses, you're hindering your own freedom. That's really what you're doing. And so all of the excuses that we make, we're keeping our freedom at bay. We think we're keeping the discomfort at bay, like, oh yeah, I don't want to do this. I'm avoiding this, whatever, because there's good reason. And I can come up with the reasons because it's going to be uncomfortable if I face it. That's what freedom is. Freedom is uncomfortable, but you can continue to buy into the reason that you're avoiding it and the good reason that you have, or you can look at it and realize, oh yeah, just caught up in thinking about myself, telling myself a story that I am believing to be the truth, that's validating my avoidance of the inevitable. And I'm just keeping my own process at bay, being just the state of processing itself, being the state of progress. You are what's happening. You are it playing out. And all of the excuses that we make for avoiding certain things, whether we're conditioned for it or not, whether there's an excuse we can come up with outside of ourselves or not, is just our own avoidance.
I'll admit that when this was the suggested topic this week, I immediately had a bad taste in my mouth. And it's only because the idea of conditioned passivity really does ring as looking for someone to blame for not wanting to change or not wanting to stand up. And again, I will admit there is some degree of conditioning that happens over our lifetime, but a lot of that comes down to development as well. And so I want to bring this back to parenting very quickly. Children are often encouraged to avoid things that are dangerous for them. There is conditioning there, implying, well, if you go over there, there's going to be a consequence. Oh, you're going to go to bed early tonight, or you're not going to have any dessert, that kind of thing. And again, that can be taken too far, but it is the parent's job to try and create some kind of a framework to protect that child from the things that child does not understand until the child is old enough and has the wherewithal to be responsible. And so you could blame the parents for disempowering that child by not letting them go and play with sharp knives when they're 6 years old. Or you can recognize that there are stages to all of this. And so it's very easy, especially when we feel like we're being disempowered, to blame someone else. In the same way that a child will often blame their parents for not getting what they want and not being happy because they didn't get what they want. And the parents have an entirely different point of view. Now, that all said, not all parents have an entirely different point of view. Some parents are actually just disempowering because they're totally egotistical. They're not doing it for the child. And I think that there is very much the consideration for this conversation, because when we're talking about society or talking about our parents, we have to remember how much of the influence we've been exposed to is really the result of awareness or habit, right? Like, for example, our society will always indicate that there is a consequence to questioning society because that's how it survives. There will always be this idea that if you question too far outside the norm, you're going to be rejected, because we very much depend on acceptance and validation and that entire mindset, right? And so there's always going to be the mechanism of that mindset to protect itself in its frame of mind, the value that it derives from the way that it lives, right? So it doesn't matter what society or what relationship you're in, there is always going to be some degree of conditioned passivity. There's always going to be some degree of lesson not to rock the boat too hard, else you will lose the certainty and comfort that you have right now. And with that goes stagnation, or at least the danger of stagnation. But this is where the process of growth comes in. This is where the process of maturing comes in. Like, we as people are maturing to the point where we can question our society because we have the awareness to do so. We're not out there threatening revolution. We're not trying to rebel against anything. Therefore, we're not the same danger that we would have been in that mentality, right? And that's the mentality that they're really trying to make passive. Like, when we talk about conditioned passivity, it helps to remember that humans used to be fucking violent.
Yeah, because it's always that as above, so below. So because we're so bought into perception of division, believed to be the truth, that egotistical mentality is represented throughout society. And so I see that as very much equated, the questioning of society being the questioning of your idea of yourself. And there's similar uncomfortable consequences to both, which also lead to freedom eventually. But at first, it's going to be uncomfortable, just like, questioning society, being like, well, is everything how we think it is? Maybe, maybe that conspiracy over there has a little bit of truth to it. And immediately you get tons of pushback because that's uncomfortable for anyone else to look at. You're like, no, I want things to be exactly how I think they are, and I want them to be comfortable. And my point of view right now makes me comfortable enough. So stop that right now. It's the same for our idea of ourselves and the story that we tell ourselves and the excuses that we're holding on to as to why we remain conditionedly passive. And so it's uncomfortable, similar to the way that it's uncomfortable to question society. It's uncomfortable to question our excuses. We think we're deriving some benefit from those excuses, but it's just keeping you in that comfortable prison. Like with so many things we talk about, they just circle around this, the desire to quote unquote stay the same, which isn't possible, but we can do a pretty darn we can do a pretty darn good job of thinking that we can, and stagnating and resisting the change and the process that we're always a part of, the flow of the river. We can actually resist it so much that we cause a lot of suffering for ourselves. And that's the same thing with this conditioned passivity. It's like it requires excuses, it requires reasons as to why we stay that way. And oftentimes when it comes to the conditioning and the reasons we come up with, there's a fear of failure. Maybe for a while we were told there were repercussions to being active, taking that step, taking that leap into uncertainty, and we got some pushback or blowback, or we got rejected, or we got punished for taking that step ourselves. So now we have this reason that we remain passive, that we don't quite act how we feel like we want to in the moment. And then there's all these reasons as to why we don't. Well, I've tried that before and it didn't work. And we have to maintain that story in order to stay in that state. But the alternative is questioning that story, is recognizing that, oh, this excuse, yeah, I'm pinning it on someone else, but it's one that I'm maintaining. No one else is maintaining the excuse. No one else is maintaining the story besides you. And that's can be a tough pill to swallow at first, but that's the other side of that. The willingness to let go of that story is where freedom lies. It's always that. There's always that wall. Story we tell ourselves, the idea of ourselves that we believe to be the truth that never actually is, but we do so many things to maintain that with good reason, come up with all the reasons in the world. And it's uncomfortable to let that go, no differently than it's uncomfortable to question society and think a little bit differently and recognize that, oh, maybe we don't have it all figured out. Oh, maybe I don't know myself. Maybe this thing, there's something to learn from this. Maybe I don't have to maintain this excuse. Maybe I can let this excuse go. It's very uncomfortable. Doesn't mean it's not worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. But as always, it comes down to a level of awareness, right? Like we talk about the consequences of acting in a certain way, and our society very much runs on consequence in order to keep you on the straight and narrow and in order to keep society running. And that's just part of it. If you break a law, you're going to jail, that kind of thing. And so right there, we have this conditioned passivity. Like I've actually had police officers tell me, you shouldn't have defended yourself. You should have waited until we got here. That was an argument that was made to me after defending myself. And had I not defended myself, I wouldn't have survived for them to get there. And yet, without missing a beat, they're like, that's not up to you. That's up to us. So, right there, you can understand why many of us don't want to stand up, why many of us feel like we can't, in fact, be responsible for ourselves. But I'd like to point out that didn't stop me from doing it. Right? Because the point is to be aware of the conditioning and even to be aware of where it's beneficial. And then still make a choice in awareness. It's kind of like Andrew was saying, I think it was episode 2, about traffic lights. Nobody's saying they shouldn't exist. What we're saying is that they're not the gateway to crossing the road. Right? If the road is empty, you can cross it. It's not like you have to wait for the light. Right? But we actually get to the point where, like, no, if the light doesn't say I can't go, I can't go. Why? Outside of you just not being aware of why the light is there, how it got there, the purpose that it functions, right? That's pretty much it. And that's often the case. Like with the law, I've said this before. A lot of people don't break the law because they're afraid of the consequences. I don't do things that would be considered breaking the law because of how it would impact other people. It has nothing to do with the consequences to me.
Yeah, and that's both of those last ones were good points, and just how much this is reinforced, how much this mentality is reinforced. Because with crossing the street, for example, like jaywalking, if someone sees you, even in a crosswalk, and it says stop, it has the hand up, like technically, I doubt it happens super often, but technically speaking, they can give you a ticket for that. We've gotten so caught in that we don't even trust ourselves, because the ones enforcing it, like, well, what would happen if we didn't have these laws? It would be chaos, because as soon as one thing gets questioned and let go of, like, the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. So we actually maintain these. It's reinforced by us that, like, no, you can't be aware for yourself, and they don't really want you to be aware for yourself. They don't want you thinking for yourself. Why do you think mushrooms have been illegal for a while? They don't want people questioning stuff, starting to get curious about things. So this mentality that we talk about all the time, being willing to let go of things, being willing to question your story, the excuses you hold on to, there's a lot reinforcing the opposite, be it in society or religion. They don't want you questioning shit, because as soon as you start questioning them, everything that their power and authority is derived from starts tumbling down, because you start to realize, oh, wait, I can also think for myself. I can choose for myself. Maybe I don't need, Sky Daddy or Big Daddy government, Uncle Sam, whatever you want to call it, telling me how to live, telling me the best way to live. Because without that, then all the things that our society relies upon, all of the marketing tactics, all of the things that, they say you need this in order to have value, comes crumbling to the ground, comes tumbling down. As soon as even just the smallest things start getting questioned, they need to maintain control of everything, even when you fucking cross the street, or else they're at risk. And so they don't want you questioning. So even with the, conditioned passivity, there's a lot of things in our environment that are reinforcing us to want to maintain those excuses. Yeah, those excuses are super valid. Definitely. Yeah, you definitely have that disorder. Just take these drugs that we happen to make a shitload of money off of. Just keep doing that and you'll be just fine. We got your back.
So this really does come back to what I was saying earlier regarding egotistical parents at the end of the day, because egotistical parents who are insecure never ever want their children to get old enough that they can question the rules that they've made. That's why they get upset. My house, my rules, right? When you're under my roof, you do as I say. All that bullshit, right? Well, why is that? Well, because the parents have stopped growing at a certain point. And so anything that is growth beyond that point becomes terrifying. It becomes a threat. And that's our society in a nutshell. We have settled at a certain point of egotism. We have created mechanisms to perpetuate that mentality, and we've created consequences to pushing too far beyond that mentality or creating too much destruction within that mentality. But somehow, despite all of that, we are operating under the assumption that we're at peak society. And that's it. It's the fact that we are faced with this opportunity to grow up. But that means recognizing that whatever passivity we have been conditioned to have isn't a prison. We can change with awareness. We can change with the recognition of not just how we've been conditioned, but why we've been conditioned, what the benefits and consequences of that conditioning might be, where the mentality came from that created that conditioning, where the mentality is going as a result of that conditioning, and what changes are possible through letting go of that conditioning. And there's so many considerations in this. And yet we can simplify it all the way down to just, oh, they're telling me what to do.
Exactly. Like, as much as it is being reinforced, and we're the ones maintaining that state. We're the ones maintaining the prison. We're the ones maintaining it always. Yeah, everything's being reinforced. Society wants you to stay in that. There's lots of reasons people tell you it's good to stay in that prison. It's safe. It's comfortable. But the whole time, you're holding the key. The whole time, even beyond that, you're the one, like, holding the door closed. So it's not even that you have to do anything active. You just let it go, and the door opens, and you can explore that. But you have to be willing to do it. There's tons of reasons to why we maintain these things. There's tons of people relying upon us remaining passive, not thinking for ourselves in any state of clarity with any degree of awareness. Awareness is actually it's actually reinforced that we shouldn't be aware and think for ourselves. And there's so many people relying upon us not doing so. So many industries relying upon us not doing so. And it actually reminded me, and I've talked about my parents in the past before, but I do realize more and more just throughout our groups and hearing about people's experiences how lucky I am to have the parents that I do who really like never relied upon us for their sense of validation. And there was a conversation my dad had when I was, you know, relatively older, like probably late teens, maybe even like 20, where he sat me down and he was like, Andrew, I've loved, being your dad. I'm always going to love being your dad. But and I forget what caused this. There was some sort of conversation that led to this. And he's like, but I've kind of, taught you everything I know, sort of thing. And so there wasn't that, it was like a very clear conversation where it was like, you don't need to rely upon me anymore for anything. Like you are your own person to learn and grow as you see fit. I'll always be here, if you want to chat about certain things. But it was like a very memorable sort of like, it was like, I don't know, you call it like fucking passing to the baton or torch or whatever. Just the letting go is like when you talk to Celeste and you're like, I'm not dad. You have this idea. And for me, it just happened, a lot later in life. And it's a different conversation when you're, 7 versus when you're 20. But a lot of people still maintain those ideas. A lot of people, when they're fucking 50 years old, parents are 70 and they're still seeing them in that way, still thinking of it in that way, still, seeking a validation from them because the parents are coming at it from a super egotistical mentality, thinking, I need my kids to rely upon me still. They still want to play that role because for them, if they're not mom or if they're not dad, they don't know what they are. They rely upon that certainty as well. So there is absolutely a responsibility from both ends, but for your experience, the responsibility comes down to you. And there's always going to be people, especially parents, who are relying on you seeing them in a certain way. And it doesn't mean that you have to. It doesn't mean that you have to continue to play that game. It's not going to be comfortable, but there's an opportunity for them to learn as well. Not saying that all of them will, but there could be a learning experience that they don't even see is a possibility. And you bringing it to the table will at least allow them to see it for what it is. But like with everything, still on you. As much as you want to think, oh, my parents are the ones doing it. My parents are keeping me stuck. My parents are the reason for this and that and this and that. It still comes down to you.
Absolutely. And I want to mention, because I know we're going to wrap this up there fairly shortly, regarding passivity. I think it's really important to remember that the opposite is activity. And if you are constantly being active without any self-reflection, that is equally as damaging, if not more damaging. I mean, this is often why people go out into society trying to prove something. They're super active and they end up in jail or they end up in some serious shit. And it's because they aren't necessarily appreciating that there's a balance to life. And so even in terms of passivity, recognizing that a passive stance is also a self-reflective stance to a very large degree, so long as you don't feel trapped by it. It's just like we were saying before about being an introvert versus an extrovert. They both inform each other, right? Your periods of being alone inform what you need to learn about people, and your periods with people inform what you need to learn about yourself. So in terms of passivity and activity, being passive isn't necessarily in itself a bad thing. If somebody comes up to you and they say something without any consideration and it hits one of your triggers, and your immediate reaction is to speak up and defend yourself and lash out, is that a better response than to not do that, reflect on it, and then deal with it in your own time without necessarily having to engage that person and demanding that they change in accordance to what you need? So there are lessons in both sides. It really just comes down to, again, choice. And the choice is ours now. It's always ours now. So if you don't want to be passive, be active with awareness. Don't do it to prove something, because at that point, you're going to recognize there's a consequence. The same is true for being passive. Don't do it out of fear. Do it out of awareness. As with everything, it's the conditioning that's the problem. It's the fact that we fall into habits without awareness. It's not the passivity. It's not the activity. It's just the fact that we lack awareness. And there are consequences to lacking awareness, always.
I'm glad you brought this point up, because, yeah, passive and active, they're just words. They're just things that we use to describe certain degrees of activity or lack of activity. It's not what you are. It doesn't define you. It's just a product of, a certain experience. And there is a time and a place, as Ray said, where being super active is awesome and being super passive is awesome. It's just like, as you said, like introversion and extroversion. Like, you're not a fucking introvert and you're not a fucking extrovert. You're not a passive person. You're not an active person. But as long as you think you are, it's going to create conflict with reality. It's going to create suffering, because there are absolutely times and places to be super active and super passive. And if you're caught up in one side of it, thinking that conditioned passivity is objectively bad and therefore activity is objectively good, there's going to be no sensitivity. There's going to be no awareness. It's like following the fucking rules. It's like following morality. It's like following the 10 Commandments without any sensitivity whatsoever. As long as I do this. It's like it's gotten so easy that for a lot of sects of Christianity, just as long as you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you're going to heaven. Oh, that's all? Oh, cool. Sounds great. I don't need any fucking sensitivity, any awareness about anything that I'm doing, as long as before I die, Jesus Christ, you're my Lord and Savior. Amen. Thank you, baby Jesus, and all that shit. As long as you do that, you're going to heaven. It's like, what the fuck? Like, we've gotten so far from sensitivity and awareness, from a lack of need for rules, that we will take the most shallow shit. It's the same in a lot of other religions. As long as you go to confession before you die, like, okay, so I don't have to be aware of shit that I'm doing. I can just do whatever I want all the time. And so it really does, like with everything, come down to that sensitivity and awareness. But those things are way easier when you're not trying to live up to an ideal, when you're not living your life based on the idea of yourself and how it lives up to everything else. Because then you're going to see other people just following these things and they're becoming something you want to become. And you're like, okay, so I just have to follow these rules because they got there. I want to get there. And they said it just takes these 5 things to get to where I'm at. So then you're just spending your whole life trying to be something again. So letting go of the idea of yourself, letting go of the needs that are oftentimes an aspect of conditioning, letting go of those is what allows you to be sensitive and aware to the experience. But there's, much as there isn't a process, the process is always happening now. So any idea you have of a process that's happening is a degree of avoidance of what's possible here and now.
On a final note, I would like to add that it really helps to remember that the rules that we once willingly listened to in regards to our parents stop being as influential when we stop wanting to be like our parents. And so it's not necessarily that we are conditioned to passively be like them. It's that we are invested in being like them. And so passivity to some degree makes sense until we no longer want to be like them. And then all of a sudden that passivity no longer serves our purpose. It no longer makes sense. And we become more active. We become more expressive. We change things. But often, looking at society and feeling disempowered, we don't recognize that the reason that we feel disempowered is because we are still invested in the mentality of the system. It's not that we're conditioned so much as we're comfortable. And we'd rather say that we're conditioned than admit that we're comfortable.
Exactly. Because that's what we settle upon. That shallow experience of just feeling comfortable. And as soon as something comes around, as soon as something gives us the opportunity to question something or be a little bit more free, makes us even just a tiny bit uncomfortable, and we run for the hills as soon as that tiny little bit of discomfort comes up. So it's a lot of this comes down to that too, is just a willingness to face it for what it is, understand that, yeah, this is an aspect, my experience right now. I don't have to run. I don't know where this is going. I don't know what it means about me ever. I can actually sit in it. And any idea of what I think it means about me, probably an aspect of that conditioning. And that's what you have the opportunity to let go of as it arises. That's because that's what the discomfort is. They're opportunities to let go. How often are we going to be willing to let go of something unless it makes us uncomfortable? So you start to see the benefit, the opportunity in the discomfort, because without it, there would just be stagnation through the comfort that we're able to maintain. Like the discomfort becomes a sort of not necessity, but driving force that leads us to an opportunity and a willingness. As we're willing to face that, we have the opportunity to grow and change and shift and just continue to explore everything that we are.
But we have to grow up and take responsibility for our choices, regardless of the mentality that we existed in up until that point. And on that note, I think that's a great way to end this episode. This has been a lot of fun. Just wanted to mention very quickly that in season 5, we will only be doing one community topics episode per month. So you can suggest a topic and vote for those topics on our Discord and our Patreon page. This has been so much fun in this series, just going week by week by week. But admittedly, I am looking forward to doing a few more live shows than we have been able to do up until now, regardless of how many of these topics have been super interesting. And as much as I've enjoyed deep diving into each of them, it really is fun to engage with people one-on-one and to be able to engage them in this conversation as we're having it, as we're deep diving into all of these things. So this has been a fantastic episode, and I really appreciate the suggestion. As I said earlier, it did kind of rub me the wrong way, which is why I'm glad we did it, because it gave me a chance to look at my own conditioning.
Yeah, and it's awesome too, because in the call-in shows, in the one-on-ones, like the topics come up, and as we have more call-in shows, like if you have a topic that you wanted us to cover on a community topics, you could just bring it up. Like we have so many opportunities to connect with people, and if you have something you've wanted us to cover, like you can just bring it up in a Patreon call. You can bring it up on a call-in show. It's always there. So anyway, I have as well thoroughly enjoyed everything that community topics has been, and I look forward to it continuing on and just continuing to explore all of these topics and everything that I am in more and more depth. So I appreciate everyone sticking this one out, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.